call the meeting of January 26th to order. First item on the agenda is bill introductions. Dennis, you've got a couple of them. If you don't mind, we'll take them one at a time. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dennis State Council Firefighters. We have a couple of bills to introduce. First one is RS 2516, and they both refer to a cost of living adjustment for the members of KPS.
Okay. Committee, are there any questions on 2516? Seeing none, is there any objection? The bill will be introduced. And the next one
is RS 2517, the same subject matter.
Okay. Any questions? Any objection? Seeing none, it will be introduced. Thank you very much. Are there any additional bill introductions? Okay, committee, we will now turn our attention to a hearing on Senate Bill 322. David, can you give us an overview?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Senate Bill 332 was a bill that was recommended for introduction by the Joint Committee on Pensions, Investments, and Benefits during the committee's December 8th, 2021 meeting. The bill amends KSA 756609. This is the state surplus real estate statute, effective on and after July 1, 2022. The requirement that 80% of the proceeds from the sale of state surplus real estate be credited to the Kansas Public Employees Retirement Fund to be applied for the payment of unfunded actual pension liability for the state and school group has been removed. It's being eliminated from the statute. Under the bill, the full amount of the proceeds from any sale of state surplus real estate would be credited to the surplus real estate fund or other appropriate special revenue fund of the state agency that owned the property. Under current law, the state agency receives 20% of the proceeds, with the remaining going to KPERS. So now they'd be, under this bill, they'd be able to keep the full amount. The crediting 80% of the proceeds to KPERS was first enacted in 2012. Prior to the 2012 legislation, that 80% was credited to the state general fund. And I'd be happy to sit in for any questions.
David, thank you very much. Committee, are there questions? See none, thank you. We will now call on Alan Conroy, with the Executive Director of KPERS, for informational testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Yes, Senate Bill 322 is explained by David. Currently, the KPERS Trust Fund gets 80%, 20% stays with the agency that's selling it. As David mentioned, it was first enacted in 2012, and that was part of that the bigger sort of KPERS reform legislation at the time, which created KPERS 3, increased employer contributions, increased employee contributions, and then this was one piece of that overall sort of reform act that was attempting to improve the funded position of KPERS. And you may remember or may know, back in that time period, that funded ratio of KPERS assets liability was about 56%. And now, of course, we're in this 70%. The experience on it, I guess, has not necessarily been a big game changer in terms of additional revenue to the KPERS Trust Fund. In my testimony there, it's totaled slightly below $1.9 million over the last 10 years. And on page 2 of the testimony, you can just see those sales of real property that Capers has gotten the 80% of the sale price, so it amounts to that roughly below $1.9 million. In terms of, as you look, so it goes into the Capers Trust Fund, helps reduce the unfunded liability, but when that unfunded liability is in excess of $5 billion, that 1.9 million over 10 years doesn't, I mean, money's money, but it doesn't really move the actuarial needle when it's at that level. Our actuary, in terms of her calculations, does not assume any revenue coming in from this source, since it's irregular and since it's been pretty minimal in the grand scheme of things. So this legislation would have no actuarial cost impact to the system based on the previous 10 years. And I think our staff had done some checking, and I think there's maybe you'll hear from some other conferees, but there's currently bills in, of course, this session, as there usually are, that provide for the sale of state property. And I think there's 9 of those bills, and I think all of them provide for a carve out. So this statute would not apply in those situations. And so bottom line is, so it stopped the money coming to the trust fund, but the last 10 years, it's not been actuarially significant, and our actuary does not assume any revenue from this potential revenue stream. Be glad to respond to any questions.
Alan, thank you very much. And I noticed on your chart on page 2 that if you consider the sale of the Dillon House in the insurance building, that was almost half of what was deposited. And so I know that certainly since 2012, there's been a number of state properties that have been sold. So evidently all of the rest of them have had the carve out in them that has kind of become the norm. And then we don't have a feel for how much property has not been sold because the proceeds would go to Capers instead of remaining with the agency. So,
and I may just make sometimes, depending on the funding source that the building was built with, for example, if it was federal funds, then there's usually provisions that has to stay in effect with the federal accounts. It can't go just someplace else.
yeah, if I remember right, I think doesn't KDOT have a permanent carve out on their right-of-ways? And
I know we've never received anything from this sale of KDOT.
I remember right, back in 12, I think this was an amendment, a floor amendment that passed, and I think KDOT was carved out of that originally. So, committee, are there questions of Alan? See none, thank you very much. We will now turn our attention to proponent testimony. We have Blake Flanders, President and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents. Welcome, Blake.
Thank you, Chair Longbine, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today to support Senate Bill 322. 322 would eliminate the provision that credits 80% of the proceeds from the sale of the state surplus property. I just wanted to talk a little bit about our own liability in the system. Our state universities are classified as state agencies, so they would fall within this. And candidly, as small as the fiscal note is, I was a little surprised that it was any, but it very, very small, because there's no incentive really to sell this property. The board in 2019 started to address deferred maintenance, and we now have a strong plan to address that. We also did a study not only on how much deferred maintenance we have, which is over $1.2 billion, but also what's the space utilization. And our space utilization is a little under the national average because we've had a shrinking footprint. We actually need to shrink our facility footprint, and this is one way where we could drive those incentives, which I think would be really good for the system. You could sell that property. The board could ensure that it's plowed back into the deferred maintenance liability, and we could start bringing that down, along with the maintenance assessment that the board passed in policy to ensure that we start taking care of those buildings. And so Again, I'd stand for any questions, but we are enthusiastically in support of this bill.
Thank you, Blake. Committee, are there questions? I have one. Some of the conversation I've heard is that oftentimes buildings on university campuses are donor-built with proceeds from donors, and donors may not necessarily want their gift to go to Capers, and so that's been somewhat of an obstruction in the sale of property. So do you have any feel for that?
Yeah, so the one thing about donors, whether a donor is still with us in terms of life or not, other donors are always watching all buildings that are given. And certainly we haven't had state-funded buildings for a number of years. Almost all those buildings are constructed with donor funds. And so, yeah, donors would like to see if their building got sold. I can't speak for every donor, but many would say, well, are those proceeds going back to help something else which within that enterprise? In this case, I haven't done the math on what over 10 years, what 1.8-ish million would do on a $5 billion liability, but it's got to be really, really small. It's probably on the wrong side of the decimal in terms of what to argue about. But I think this, again, would provide incentives. It provides incentives to the university. It doesn't irritate the entire donor community, and we can move forward reducing our own liability and the state's liability for deferred maintenance.
Okay. Thank you very much. Committee, additional questions? I see none. Thank you. Let me call your attention to proponent written testimony from Ken Hush, Interim President of Emporia State University, Ethan Erickson, who's the Chief Financial Officer at Kansas State University, and Jeff DeWitt, who is the Chief Financial Officer at the University of Kansas. Is there any additional proponent testimony? Is there any neutral testimony? Would anyone like to provide opponent testimony? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 322. We will now turn our attention on the most riveting bill of the session, Senate Bill 331. Eileen, would you give us an overview?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. This is the most riveting bill of the session, and I hope you're all holding your breath for this. This is Senate Bill 331, updating the version of risk-based capital instructions in effect. And each year, insurers are required to file their risk-based capital report with the Commissioner of Insurance and with the NAIC. The bill amends the effective date of the instructions promulgated by the NAIC that insurers use to file the report. Each year, the date changes to the last day of the preceding year, and you can see that amendment on the bill on page 2, line 2, where the year changes from 2020 to 2021. And Mr. Chair, I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Eileen. Committee, are there questions? Senator Hildebrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd hate for such a riveting bill as this to go without any questions, and I know Eileen's probably worked pretty hard on this every year, but I want to know, it appears in some places there's an Oxford comma used and others there's not. Is there a reason?
I'm sorry, Senator, can you point out where the incidences of the Oxford comma appear?
Senator Hildebrand has just come from health, I think.
I didn't think so.
Are there additional questions for the reviser? Seeing none, thank you, Eileen. We will now turn our attention to proponent testimony for Senate Bill 331 with Lee Moniset from the Kansas Insurance Department.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to be here. I'm standing up here in hopes that Senator Hildebrand got his one question out of the way, but would be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Committee, are there any questions? Senator Gossage.
My question is, why do we need to do this every year?
Good question. Eileen has talked before about the unconstitutional delegation of authority. So there's this kind of annual review. And then the RBC and what those rates should look like is done on an annual basis. Sometimes changes are made, sometimes they aren't. But rather than just deferring to whatever the current standard is, we adopt it each year.
Any other additional questions? I can also tell Senator Gossage that this is often a bill that is used to help us get home at the end of the session.
Thank you,
Any
Mr.
other questions? Seeing none, is there any additional proponent testimony on Senate Bill 331? Anyone wishing to provide neutral testimony? Is there any opposition to Senate Bill 331? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 331. That completes our agenda for today. We will meet tomorrow. We will not meet on Friday or Monday, so we'll see you tomorrow.